Dear students, welcome to this lecture. Today's topic for discussion is English philosopher Thomas Hobbes. In today's lecture, we will try to understand the ideas of Thomas Hobbes regarding human nature, state of nature, social contract, and the creation of state. Let us begin by throwing some light on his life and writings. Thomas Hobbes was born prematurely in 1588 at a time when England was threatened by the impending attack of the Spanish Armada, and when his mother was told that Spanish Armada has been spotted off the coast of England. His traumatic birth led Hobbes to exclaim that fear and I were born twins. But his fearfulness stemmed more from the period he was born in, a period of violence and troubles, than from his traumatic birth. He was witness to the great political and constitutional turmoil caused by the English Civil War, and his life and writings bear clear imprint of it. He received his education at Oxford. In 1608, he became tutor to William Cavendish. The Cavendish family were to be his patronage throughout his life. In 1610, Cavendish and Hobbes travelled to Europe together, visiting Germany, France, and Italy. After the death of Cavendish, Hobbes obtained another position, but later became tutor to Cavendish's son. During these years, he travelled to Europe, meeting leading thinkers, including the astronomer Galileo and the philosopher René Descartes. In 1640, when England was on the brink of civil war, Hobbes fled to Paris, fearing the reaction of the parliament to his writing. He remained in exile for 11 years. Between 1646 and 1648, Hobbes was a mathematics tutor to Charles, Prince of Wales, who was also in exile. In 1651, his best-known work, Leviathan, was published. For Hobbes, the only way for man to lift himself out of his natural state of fear and violence was to give up his freedom and make a social contract with others to accept a central authority. Hobbes felt that a monarchy provided the best authority. He also argued that as sovereign power was absolute, the sovereign must also be head of the national religion. He was, as a result, hostile to the Roman Catholic Church. This made him unpopular with the French authorities, and in 1651 he returned to England. He continued to write, producing works on mathematics and physics, as well as on philosophy, and engaging in academic disputes. In 1660, his former pupil returned to England as Charles II and granted Hobbes a pension. In 1666, Parliament ordered Leviathan to be investigated for atheist tendencies. Hobbes was terrified of being labeled as heretic and burned many of his papers. Charles II intervened on his behalf, but the condition seems to have been that Hobbes published nothing further on overtly political subjects. He died in 1679 at Hardwick Hall in Derbyshire, one of the Cavendish family's homes. Let us now try to understand his views on human nature. For Hobbes to understand state properly, it was very important to understand its matter and artificer, both of which is man. So, let us first of all try to understand his views on human nature. Contrary to Aristotle and the medieval thinkers who saw human nature as innately social, Hobbes viewed human beings as isolated, egoistic, self-interested, and seeking society as means to their ends. For Hobbes, individuals were creatures of desire, seeking pleasure and avoiding pain. Pleasures were good and pain bad. That is the reason why men sought to pursue and maximize their pleasures and avoid pain. In addition to being a creature of pleasure and pain, Hobbes saw human beings as matter in motion, and this motion being of two types. The first he calls vital or involuntary motion, by which he means the basic and unthinking life functions of inhalation, digestion, circulation, and so on. These comprise purely the physical aspect of human existence and are the subject matter of physiology. The second Hobbes calls voluntary motion, by which he means those forms of human activity that are willed, such as walking and speaking. Voluntary motions or endeavor, as Hobbes calls them, are basically of two types, either towards an object or away from an object. This endeavor, when it is towards something which causes it, is called appetite or desire, and when the endeavor is fromward something, it is generally called aversion. Human beings are nothing but bundles of appetites and aversions, and life consists in satisfying one desire after another. For Hobbes, the cessation of desire is what we call death, and felicity or happiness is the movement from one fulfilled desire to another. For Hobbes, happiness remains the goal of life. Defining happiness or felicity as the continuous satisfaction of our desires, Hobbes makes desire the engine of all human action. So, life is about the continuous fulfillment of one's desires, and human beings take the help of their reason in order to satisfy their desires. Human beings do not just have passions, they have reason too. But their reason is a mere slave of their passions, and its role is to devise the most efficient means of achieving these passions. Hobbes also contended that life was nothing but a perpetual and relentless desire and pursuit of power, which is a prerequisite for felicity. He pointed out that one ought to recognize a general inclination of all mankind, a perpetual and restless desire for power after power that ceases only in death. Consequently, individuals were averse to death, especially accidental death, for it marked the end of attainment of all felicity. Human beings seek power as it represents a means of acquiring those things that made life worthwhile and contented. The fact that all individuals, and not merely the political elite, sought power distinguished Hobbes from Machiavelli. Another significant facet of Hobbes' perception that set him apart from both ancient and medieval philosophers was his belief in the equality of men. By equality, Hobbes meant equal ability and the equal hope of attaining the ends individuals aspired for. The physically weak may achieve by cunning what the strong could accomplish through force. Hobbes accepted differences in physical or natural endowments. Hobbes also saw human beings as active creatures with a will. Human beings were endowed with both reason and passions, reason being passive while passion is active. Differences in passions created differences in wits with a desire to excel over others. Since individuals were equal and active, those who succeed tend to have more enemies and competitors and face maximum danger. Hobbes observed that human beings stood nothing to gain from the company of others except pain. A permanent rivalry existed between human beings for honor, riches, and authority, which makes life as nothing but potential warfare, a war of everyone against the others. Let us now move to another important facet of Hobbesian philosophy, state of nature. With this conception of human nature, Hobbes presents us with the concept of state of nature. For Hobbes, it was a condition when human beings were living without government. In the light of bleak and pessimistic human nature, he paints a dark picture of state of nature. His state of nature represents a state of war. Ceaselessly pursuing their desires with no agreement on good and bad, human beings come in conflict with each other. Since the state of nature is also a state of freedom and equality, with everyone having the right to do as one wishes and no one being naturally inferior to anyone else. It adds to the level of hostility because no one draws back from pursuing which they desire. In fact, the attempt to acquire power after power never ceases because everyone is trying to ensure that no one can stop them from fulfilling their desires. Not only is it part of human nature to continuously fulfill new desires, one desire that is part of the nature of man is the desire for glory. Human beings cannot stand for any sign of others undervaluing them. This creates a situation of ever-present hostility in which there is no point in undertaking long-term projects like cultivating a farm, for instance, because there is no security that one will get to enjoy the fruits of this agricultural labor. In such a condition, there is no place for industry because the fruit thereof is uncertain, and consequently no culture of the earth, no navigation, no commodious building, no knowledge of the face of the earth, no account of time, no arts, no letters, no society, and worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death. And the life of man is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. In this ill condition, there was no law, no justice, no notion of right and wrong, with only force and fraud as the two cardinal virtues. The principal cause of conflict was within the nature of man. Competition, diffidence, and glory were the three reasons that were responsible for quarrel and rivalry among individuals. The first make men innovate for gain, the second for safety, and the third for reputation. Under these circumstances, the state of nature degenerated into a state of war, a war of every man against every man. After presenting a dark picture of the state of nature, Hobbes introduces the idea of laws of nature. Besides being the epitome of passions and desires, human beings, as per Hobbes, also have reason. So, they can see in the state of nature that there must be a more efficient way of fulfilling their desires. And it is here Hobbes introduces his third major idea, the idea of the laws of nature. There are passages in the Leviathan which present the laws of nature as the precepts of reason, as rational rules which show the way as to how to achieve one's desires. Hobbes lists as many as 19 such laws. The first law of nature commands men to seek peace and to follow it. The third law of nature commands men to perform their covenants made. The ninth commands that every man acknowledge the other for his equal by nature. And the 17th, that no man be allowed to be judge in his own case. If we look at the content of these laws of nature, we can see how Hobbes would argue that human reason in the form of laws of nature would persuade human beings that they would have a better chance of fulfilling their desires if they get out of the state of nature. Although the laws of nature existed in the state of nature, they were not followed because no one was able to enforce them. What needs to be done is to set up somebody as an enforcer of these laws. Thus enters the idea of social contract and the creation of state. All the individuals in the state of nature make a promise to each other that they will each give up their natural right in favor of the sovereign and will obey his laws. Thus, individuals surrendered all their powers through a contract to the sovereign, who was not a party to the contract, but nevertheless received all the powers that were surrendered. The Commonwealth was constituted when the multitude of individuals were united in one person, when every person said to the other, and I quote, "I authorize and give up my right of governing myself to this man or to this assembly of men on this condition that you give up your right to him and authorize all his actions in like manner." Unquote. The social contract creates a sovereign and at the same time another new entity called the state. It is state that is the repository of power, with the sovereign as its representative, and the subjects owe allegiance to the sovereign as the representative of the state. Though people can choose to vest sovereignty in one person or in an assembly of persons, but Hobbes preferred the beneficiary of the contract, the third person, to be a monarch. Monarchy was preferable to an aristocracy or democracy because of the following reasons. 1. The self-indulgence of one compared to that of money would be cheaper. Second, the existence of identity of interests between the king and his subjects. And third, less intrigues and plots which were normally due to personal ambitions and envy of members of the ruling elite. The sovereign created through contract is absolute. This is evident from a long list of rights which sovereign enjoys. The people cannot, without the sovereign's permission, make a new contract to change the form of government. They cannot accuse the sovereign of any act of injustice or punish him for such acts. The sovereign has the right to be the sole judge of which policy is best for the peace and defense of the people. The sovereign has the right of censorship, and so on. For Hobbes, absolute sovereignty is important for keeping commonwealth intact. If the people are allowed to judge for themselves what is good and evil, if their property is considered to be out of the limits of the authority of sovereign, and if the sovereign is considered to be subject to his own laws, then one can be sure that the state will not be able to maintain itself. Any questioning of the absolute power of the sovereign is a step towards the dissolution of the commonwealth and a return to the state of nature, which is similar to a terrible state of war. The right to life, in fact, is the only right that Hobbes allows individuals to retain from the state of nature, as they make their transition from state of nature to commonwealth. Hobbes clearly states that this retention does not mean that the state or sovereign has a duty to respect his subjects' right to life. Since the sovereign is not a party to the social contract, he has no obligations towards the subjects. The sovereign retains his natural right to do as he wills. However, if the sovereign wills the death of any one subject, that subject has the right to defend his life. It is only the subject as an individual who retains the right of self-defense. No one has the right to help another, be it one's friend or brother, in escaping the sword of the sovereign. It is important to mention that the absolute power which sovereign enjoys is not based on the notion of the divine rights of kings. but derived through a contract that was mutually agreed upon and willingly consented. The sovereign was authorized to enact laws as he deemed fit, and such laws were legitimate. Hobbes was categorical that the powers and authority of the sovereign had to be defined with least ambiguity. The sovereign was the sole source and interpreter of laws. He was the interpreter of divine and natural laws. Unlike Bawden, Hobbes did not circumscribe the power of sovereign by placing it under divine and natural laws. In fact, sovereign was not even subject to civil laws, being the sole source of these laws. Hobbes defined the law as a command of the sovereign, a viewpoint adopted by Bentham and John Austin in their descriptions of sovereignty. The sovereign not only administered the law but also enforced it. The sovereign enjoyed absolute powers only because the individuals had totally surrendered their powers. Hobbes conceptualized an absolute sovereign only because of his thoroughgoing individualism. The absolute sovereign represented the individuals and was constituted by them for providing order and security and averting the worst of all evils, the civil war. Through his theory of political obligation, Hobbes also provided number of reasons as to why the sovereign was to be obeyed. First, there was a purely prudential consideration that if individuals disobeyed sovereign, they would be punished. Second, there was a moral consideration that they must honor their contracts, provided others did so as instructed by the first three laws of nature. The sovereign ensured that all parties adhered to the terms of the covenant. Third, there was a political consideration that the sovereign was their duly authorized representative, created with consent by the citizens, authorizing him to act on their behalf. Last, Hobbes offered a religious argument when he asserted that the civil law and the law of nature was one, and that both were to be obeyed since they implied God's commands. For his ideas, Thomas Hobbes faced a lot of criticism. Many of his critics have denied the reality of the state of nature, both as a statement of fact or as a hypothesis. It has been contended that if individuals were so asocial, they would never have been able to come together to establish a civil society and government. If they could do so, then they would have never gone without it. His critics insist that Hobbes' depiction of state of nature was unreal, grossly exaggerated and even misleading. It has been frequently pointed out that his social contract is unhistorical and impossible, that the story of primitive societies has shown conclusively that men move from status to contract which is possible only at a comparatively late stage of their evolution. It is also difficult to understand how the masters of his state of nature became the law-abiding and docile citizens of the society. The sudden transformation of the individual from savage to the civilized seems quite illogical. Through his social contract, Hobbes created an absolute sovereign which critics said would endanger the liberty of individuals instead of protecting it. That is why many of his critics felt the need to control government by the superior authority of the society. Lawson and Whitehall, contemporary critics of Hobbes, demanded the need to bind the rulers by law, else they would usurp little by little. They feared the consequences of arbitrary power. Clarendon and Whitehall asserted that Hobbes had no idea of practical politics and that his theorem of government was artificial. All his critics insisted on the need to provide for a limited and constitutional authority. Lastly, Professor Vaughan has rejected his theory of sovereignty as pernicious and impossible. It is pernicious because it leads to despotism, as it gives subjects no right against the oppressive and tyrannical rule and reduces them to slavery. It is impossible in so far as sole bond of union among individuals in commonwealth is common terror, the fear of relapsing into the state of nature. But despite these shortcomings, his contribution to political thought can never be underestimated. Professor Sabine rightly describes him as, and I quote, probably the greatest writer on the political philosophy that the English-speaking people have produced. Dear students, it was all about today's lecture regarding the ideas of Thomas Hobbes. I hope you enjoyed this lecture. Thank you.